and they had some bed sheets tied together like we would see in one of those old movies, but it was on the 6th floor. Now, how are you gonna get, how much bed sheets do you have to get down from the 6th floor?
All right, I got a very special guest, an acclaimed author, Mr. Alan Geik, and he's going to be talking to us about his book that he recently wrote, Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz, which is the perfect topic for my channel. How you doing, Alan?
I'm doing great, and thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure having you. Are you kidding? Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So give me a little bit of, before we get into the book, give me a little bit of your background, because I was only able to read, I only received the book a couple of days ago, so I was only able to read the first few pages, but supposedly this is family oriented. Am I accurate?
Yes, it is. It's like, it was a family culture that seemed so normal at the time, an organized crime family culture. As I look back, I didn't think of it in those terms back then. It was just ordinary. And there was Uncle Charlie, who I knew of when he was in jail. He was in jail for 23 years for killing Dutch Schultz. I met him when I was in my early 20s. My brother, coincidentally and sort of ironically, was a detective in the New York City Police Department, and I write a fair amount about him. And there were all these characters who went to Las Vegas and opened the Stardust. My Uncle George and Johnny DioGuardi. The Italians and the Jews, by the way, which was a theme in the book. It wasn't really intended to be, because it also seemed so normal. They were like, they were the most brotherly ethnic groups in organized crime, and probably and outside also. But they built businesses that lasted for 30 years together. I mean, but you asked me about my background. I went to City College in New York, and from there I went to the London School of Economics. I paid, it cost $79 for tuition for the year, when you think about how much people have to pay nowadays. But I wound up wanting to be in the film business, so I worked at Wide World of Sports during the era of Muhammad Ali and Howard Cosell.
Oh my God.
And I saw Muhammad Ali. He stopped traffic on 6th. And you can imagine at that time. And then from there, I wanted to be in the real film business, so I moved out to Hollywood with no job, and I wound up at Wide World, at Paramount Pictures for 11 or 12 years. I was supposed to be there for 30 days, and I never missed a paycheck for the next 12 years. So it was a great gig. And at the same time, I wound up doing a radio show, public radio show, college radio show, of Afro-Cuban music, Jewish boy from the Bronx playing Afro-Cuban music.
Wow. Really.
It had 24 hours on the weekend, and I was just one of several DJs. And just a month ago, we had a 50th anniversary of a college radio show. I mean, that's unheard of. Imagine a college radio show being on the air for 50 years.
Yeah, especially now, right?
Yes. So that's sort of that background. But the background in the book was, as I always think about it, these people were normal in my life, and I would see their names in newspapers. And as I got older, talking to them, especially, there was a difference when my brother was around, as I think back, because they took him as one of them. He was a detective when New York was really much dirtier than it is now.
What years were it?
I'm talking about the mid 60s to the mid 70s.
Yeah, that was probably the worst time of New York City.
And my brother, there was a group called the Special Investigations Unit, which they put together after the French Connection. French Connection gave the police department such good publicity, because these two detectives busted the whole ring. They decided, why not put this unit together to go after big drug dealers? And my brother, because he had connections, mob connections, who were his rabbis in the police department, he wound up part of it. And he got busted with 75 detectives in that unit. About 50 of them got busted, and they made the movie Prince of the City out of it. He was actually, he was the first bad cop in the book that was mentioned, and his name was mentioned throughout because it's a unique name. It's not like you can miss it. And, but what that gave him was some kind of street cred also with the gangster part of the family.
Right.
That's sort of.
Well, I am definitely going to have you on again for movies because I'm a movie nut. Okay, so we're going to wind up doing a part 2 of this for movies because I had one movie critic on, and unfortunately it didn't do well because most people like the true crime and the mafia stuff on my channel. But you know, they're on strike right now, and it's very sad that nobody cares, and the movies they put out are complete garbage. There's no originality. It's just horrible. I don't know how many superhero movies you could make. They're making them even if they don't make any money. But let's get back to the book Dutch Schultz. Now, I'm 47 years old. Okay, so I grew up in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, which was all Italian at the time. But the first time I ever heard of Dutch Schultz was the movie with Dustin Hoffman. And Dustin Hoffman portrayed Dutch Schultz during a time when mob movies, gangster movies were huge in the 90s. And I wasn't crazy about Dustin Hoffman in the role, but there was another movie that portrayed Dutch Schultz called Hoodlum. And I don't remember his name, but the actor that portrayed Dutch was fantastic. Tim Roth. He was fantastic. So if anybody wants to know the actual story of Dutch Schultz, go and watch the movie Hoodlum. It is in Harlem. It has all the major players: Bumpy Johnson, Queenie, Lucky Luciano of the time, Dutch Schultz. Now, why don't you explain, before we get into the book, explain who Dutch Schultz was and how infamous, if you will, as a gangster during that time.
Dutch Schultz was born Arthur Flegenheimer, which was his real name, and he became a mob boss in the late 20s into the early 30s. But he was always a little bit on the outs because he never dressed well. One of the signs of the gangsters then and probably now is that you showed your success, and he always dressed. One reporter called him a vagrant. But that was beside the point. He also was very cheap in a lot of his mannerisms, and he ran into a problem. He got arrested, and they had a big trial in upstate New York. All the other bar bosses in New York, Lucky Luciano, Trigger Mike Coppola, all these people thought he would get convicted, but he was upstate, and the way he dressed was interesting because he was accepted by the community more than he would have been if he dressed like a New York gangster. That's how he dressed and looked and acted. So he got acquitted. And it was like a huge, big deal at the time. And the governor wanted him badly. So they hired a young Thomas Dewey, who later was the governor of New York and ran for president against Harry Truman. He was a young prosecutor. And they wanted Dutch Schultz for tax evasion. They had just convicted Al Capone a few years for tax evasion, so they thought they could get him too. And his attitude was, I want to kill Tom Dewey. So the mob bosses, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, whoever else was involved in these decisions, said, no, you can't do that because we're done once that happens. Everybody loves us because we're delivering free booze. Booze during the Prohibition, we're taking their numbers. We're okay with the people in the community. Once you do that, everything changes, and he insisted upon it, so they took him out instead. There was a number of backstories, several of which I had heard from my own childhood, including the Cleveland part of my family. They wanted to take over a racetrack that Dutch Schultz owned in Cincinnati. And he had that racetrack because he was using that number for the people who played the numbers, which you could find out in the newspapers, from being in Bensonhurst. The number would be printed in the newspaper in the racetrack. So they used his racetrack. He used his racetrack, and he was able to fix the number. Mm-hmm. And he never got the idea that the best publicity you could have was someone hitting the number, because they were going to tell everybody. You couldn't, I mean, it was 600 to 1 that they paid off for a 900 to 1. It should have been 900. They made a huge amount of money, and he never wanted to pay anyone off. But to get back to they wanted to kill him, and one of the people they hired was the man I called Uncle Charlie when he got out of jail, because, and he was betrayed, informed on by other mob, Jewish gangsters, Jewish Murder Incorporated hitmen, and one of them was A.B. Rellis, who was thrown out of the Half Moon Hotel down the street from where you're from.
I did an episode on him, actually. Yeah, I did an episode on
Abe Rellis.
It was the 5 biggest mafia rats, and he
had to be.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it was sort of funny, because it was all so normal to me when I was about 9 years old, and I told this story at the Mob Museum, which allowed me to come by and do a presentation. And when I was about 9 or 10 years old, we were on the boardwalk at Coney Island. And as we walked by, some of the people, the men who were in the group, one of them said, "Oh yeah, that's the Half Moon Hotel. That's where the police threw Abe Rellis out the window." And I said, "What do you mean, police threw somebody out the window?" And that's sort of the environment that I grew up in. And as I learned as I got older, that was a dad joke at the time in that environment. So as I got older, I learned that was the world they inhabited. But Dutch Schultz got killed. Uncle Charlie and another man named Mendy Weiss, who was in the electric, who was electrocuted in Sing Sing for another murder. They were the 2 guys who took out Dutch Schultz and his three associates.
Yeah. What's funny is that I mentioned him too, Weiss, in another episode of famous murderers of the mafia. But Dutch Schultz, the majority of his operations were in Harlem, correct?
They were yes, he had some in downtown, in some, from what I understood, unions that he also had parts of. But his big money-making operation in the last few years of his life was the numbers in Harlem.
So if people, for people who don't know the numbers was like an illegal lottery, right? You could explain what the numbers is.
Well, it started in Italian community, probably at the turn of the century, maybe even earlier. It was big in Black and Latino communities also. And it was under the, what it was people would pick 3 numbers from 0 to 1 up to 0, all 10 numbers. And you would pick 3 numbers. And if those numbers came in, you would collect 600 to 1 at the time. But if you really think about it, the real odds is 900 to 1. So whoever's taking the action is making a huge amount of money. And it became a multi-million-dollar business in working class neighborhoods, Italian, Black. Actually, I remember it in my neighborhood too. When Milton stood at the subway station and would take people's number. And it could be a penny, a nickel, a dime, a quarter, a dollar, whatever it was. And the way you would find out, one of the ways you would find out if your number came in, was Daily News and Mirror, because in the back of it, they would have the racetrack results, and at the bottom, it would be total mutual handle, which was the amount of money bet for that whole day on all 9 races, or however many races they had. So it might be 1,326,422.
Yeah, it was the last 3 numbers.
The last 3 numbers were the number for the day in the Brooklyn number, as they called it. So everybody could, and I remember when I was a kid, my father would send me out for the News and Mirror. They were 5 cents at the time. And I would stand there with all these men smoking cigars, and all they were waiting for was for the newspaper to come.
Yeah.
And the truck would pull up, and just like you'd see in the old movies, throw the newspaper bundle onto the street. And it was very exciting for me to hang around. But that was the number. And Dutch Schultz controlled the number in Manhattan and until he died. And then Trigger Mike Coppola, who was my Uncle George's mentor, really. I wrote a lot about him in the book, too, because my Uncle George, when he was 18, Trigger Mike hired him for a hit in Cleveland, and Uncle George wound up becoming a big shot at the Desert Inn and delivered money to Mike Coppola, his one-time mentor from the Desert Inn. 40 years later, and when you think of those associations, they really lasted a long time based on a handshake. It wasn't like anyone was going to take someone to court if they didn't fulfill their
right.
So that was the Dutch Schultz story, and he got taken out in I think it was November of 1935.
Yeah. So, and correct me if I'm wrong. So I'm just gonna give some feedback on what the reputation of Dutch Schultz was. He was a little nuts, but he was also very brass and cocky, and he was how you would call, like you said, the way he dressed, he would dress like he was basically a slob, right?
Good word, yeah.
Yeah, he was basically a slob, and he was very brass, and he didn't have a lot of respect when he talked to mafia members or other so on and so forth. And he was making them money because you couldn't operate back then without kicking back to them. It was impossible, right? But then it got to the point where he was kind of like really ruffling a lot of feathers, and the Thomas Dewey thing was the icing on the cake.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there was another thing going on at the time, which I learned more in my research for the book than I knew at the time. Organized crime was becoming organized, and what it really was, it was the people who had foresight, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky and several others. They saw it as a business, a huge business that was going to be interconnected, cities all over the country, and it wound up becoming so diversified. People bought little traded pieces of their business. Trigger Mike, who I just mentioned, also had pieces of the casinos Uncle George had in Cleveland and what Meyer Lansky had. So that those were the people that were really going to make organized crime work. And they had two Italian bosses, one named Massari and the other Maranzano, and they had to take them out because these were the old school Italian guys who didn't want, not only did they not want Jews in it, they didn't even want Italians who weren't from Sicily.
Yeah, they didn't want to work with anybody.
Yeah, so they took those guys out, but then they had to war on the Jews because there was one old-time Jewish gangster whose name was Waxy Gordon, and he was older than Meyer Lansky and a little older than Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano. And he didn't want to be bossed by them. So they wound up setting him up to go to jail for 10 years. And the other one who had no, as you were just describing so accurately, he was an odd man out, Dutch Schultz. He was a loose cannon. And so they had to take him out. And so because they really wanted to organize this, and you had to be an organization man to be in it. Oddly enough, into organized crime.
Yeah, it's amazing. They formed it like a corporation, but corporations just fire you if you don't go the way they want. They would kill you.
That's right. Yeah, and when you think about it, they had so much money. I mean, it was.
And they even had. What's funny is they even had an HR department. They had a human resources department, and it was called Murder Incorporated.
That's right. And Uncle Charlie was one of them. And what was interesting was that, and I was when we were younger, we being my brother and I, my sister was younger than both of us, but she wasn't into she learned a lot about the women, and which I had no interest in at the time, but their stories were really more poignant and interesting in their own way. But my brother and I thought of Uncle Charlie when he was in prison. He was a 25-year-old guy who went into a bar with one other guy, and they killed 4 men who had guns and were firing back. And Uncle Charlie dips into Dutch Schultz's pocket and takes out $8,000. And when he gets outside, the getaway car is gone. Mendy Weiss left him because he didn't like that Dutch Schultz was Uncle Charlie was wasting time. So Uncle Charlie walked from Newark all the way back to New York. And this was the guy that we heard about when we were younger. And when he got out, there was an older man who was had some medical issues. And he was really afraid of the parole board at the time. He still had a rep. He was afraid of being asked, taken back into prison for some BS reason. And my brother, being a detective, said, "No, that's not happening. Well, we got all the people we need to make sure." So as a result, and my father, when Charlie was in jail for those 23 years, my father was a civilian. He was never part of that, but I called him mob adjacent because he knew all of them and they respected him, but he was not a mobster. He brought Charlie's family money because the mob took care, as you know, they would take care of people who were in jail who didn't inform and all that kind of stuff. So my father, when Charlie got out, he was very appreciative of what my father had done and what my brother was doing. And he always referred to me and my brother as his nephews. And I always called him Uncle Charlie. I couldn't imagine even to this day thinking of him in any other way. And when I look back, this was a man who did 23 years in jail for killing Dutch Schultz, and he was like an average uncle.
Well, to you, he was sure. Right. Yeah. So let's get into what the Murder Incorporated was and exactly who your Uncle Charlie, how he came to be part of that organization.
Well, the Murder Incorporated, as the story goes, once Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, I always use their names. There were several others along Frank Costello and all the names that we know, Vito Genovese. They organized crime in the very early 30s. Once they took out the two Italian bosses, they organized it, and they realized they needed an enforcement, or as you call it, an HR department, because they were dealing with criminals, and as much money as was on the table, there was always someone who was going to do something stupid like Dutch Schultz did and be a loose cannon. So they formed this group in Brooklyn, in Bushwick, I think it was, of Jewish and Italian men. And they were all in their mid-20s, early 20s at the time when you think about it. And these were the guys who they assigned to take out people all over the country. It wasn't just in New York. They took out people all over the country, and they were the enforcement arm of organized crime. And it all came overnight from 1935 to 1940. Everything was fine until one of my other family members, who I had pictures of him at my bar mitzvah years later, Cuppy Migden, he was a lower ranked Murder Incorporated guy. And they were going to take out some union guy who was ratting on Lepke, who was the organizer along with Albert Anastasia. So they were going to take this organizer out, and Cuppy was the guy who was going to point him out in the Bronx. But he pointed out the wrong guy coming out of the building, another guy, the same. And they killed the guy who was a music publishing salesman. And the man's last words supposedly were, "I never had an enemy in my life." And public opinion changed overnight. This is what they were afraid of with Dutch Schultz.
Right.
Because even nobody cared about organized crime. They were taking bets and doing all this stuff. The next year, William O'Dwyer became a man named William O'Dwyer, who is, I'm going to take these off. I think I can still hear you. And William O'Dwyer was born in Ireland. He was a worker, laborer, became a policeman, then the DA in Brooklyn. And he wanted to break it. There were a lot of murders. They didn't know what Murder Incorporated. No one had ever heard of it. They just knew there were a lot of murders. And they got A.B. Rellis ratted, and that's a long story.
Yeah,
that's I shortened up in the book, but he turned in everybody.
Yeah,
and one of the people he turned in was Uncle Charlie, who had killed Dutch Schultz 5 years or 6 years before that, but also mentioned it because he was pissed that the car left him where he killed Dutch Schultz. He was pissed at Mendy Weiss and the driver, so he was talking about it to Abe Relis and all these, and one or two other people who became informants. And that's how Murder Incorporated ended overnight. Once Abe Relis started to talk, one of the newspapers men in Brooklyn said, "Oh, Murder Incorporated." They never called it Murder Incorporated until a newspaper reporter in Brooklyn said, "Well, all these people are being killed by orders from one person." So that's how the name came about, and it stuck.
Yeah. Yeah, and supposedly the story goes that Relis. That's okay. Go ahead. The story goes that Abe Relis had put a lot of men away that were from Murder Incorporated, and they wanted him to give information for Abbott Anastasia. That's the story that I got, and then that's when they had gotten the cops. They probably bribed them to throw him out the window, and they tried to say that he tried to escape and fell. Yeah.
Actually, in the story that I had heard over the years, and it was sort of verified in some of the books I read as I was doing research for this, was that he was going to testify the next day against.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing. Yes.
He had already turned in a number of people, including Charlie Workman and a couple of other people, and they had some. He was up on the 6th floor of this hotel that they made over with steel doors downstairs and passes, because that's where they were going to keep these these informants. And he wasn't the only one. There was one or two others whose names are escaping right at the moment, but I did mention them in the book. And they had some bed sheets tied together like we would see in one of those old movies, but it was on the 6th floor. Now, how are you going to get, how much bed sheets do you have to get down from the 6th floor? He was also found 20 feet from the base of the building.
That's amazing.
So it must have been some police on some kind of adrenaline rush that threw him through the window. Threw him out. Instead of down, they threw him out. And that was Abe Relis, the canary who could sing but couldn't fly.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
I'm hearing that.
That's right. Now, Weiss, who was also a member of Murder Incorporated, that Relis had gave states information. He was an interesting character because supposedly he truly loved killing, and he wouldn't have a weapon with him. He would find a weapon wherever he had to do the murder. So he would either drown you, bash you with a rock, stab you, so on and so forth. He wouldn't bring a weapon with him to wherever he would use something that was there. And then when he tried, from what I understand, and you could probably know better than me, he tried acting crazy so he can get and plead insanity. And supposedly he wouldn't shower. His hair grew out. His hair grew out. He would actually go to court and chew on his lawyer's suitcase. These guys were one in a million. Now, your Uncle Charlie, how did he actually come to be part of Murder Incorporated?
That's an interesting question, because all of these guys grew up together. And I started the book off with my Uncle George, who to me was the most successful in the family. He was my father's older brother. He wound up, as I mentioned before, he was Trigger Mike Coppola's, Trigger Mike was his mentor. And Ruby Collard, another guy, they started off in the book started off with them climbing into a dry goods store on the Lower East Side. And 40 years later, Uncle George is making huge money at the Stardust, giving money to Sam Giancana. I read that was part of a investigative series that Chicago Sun-Times story investigative series. Uncle George was giving money to Trigger Mike and to Sam Giancana because they trusted him, because they couldn't go into Las Vegas because they were on the black book. But part of the group when they were kids, Johnny DioGuardi's uncle, who was a big shot in whatever his rank was in the mafia, Sammy Casa, who was Waxy Gordon's right-hand man, and later on became very close to me and my family. He was my parents' friend. They were these guys who they went through their whole life together, even if they went to jail and then they reemerged together. And Uncle Charlie was one of those people. He was a couple of years. He was my Uncle George's age, and my Uncle George was really tight with him. And I wrote in the book that my father, who was a little younger than him, one time my father and a couple of these younger kids were looking at someone like they may have been wanting to rob them.
Mm-hmm.
My father felt a slap across his head, and his little cap, those caps that they wore back then, fell on the floor, and it was Uncle George and Charlie, and they said, "We don't do shit. We do it with them." And he never was involved in it, except for some stuff that I wrote about where they trusted him with money, things of that sort. But to answer your question, Charlie grew into Murder Incorporated. My Uncle George, Trigger Mike sent him, things were getting hot in New York for Uncle George and Ruby. They sent him to Cleveland where gambling casinos were opening because Prohibition ended. And for the next 20 years, they managed gambling casinos, and then they moved to Las Vegas and opened the Stardust. They had legal gambling for the first time in their lives. They had these gambling casinos throughout Ohio that weren't hidden in roadside bars next to highways. These were like freestanding nightclubs right out there, and the police were all taken care of. So they knew how to run gambling casinos, and that's why when they went to Las Vegas, they became one of the more important elements in the early days. And if you're talking about 1950, 1960, they really ran the gambling casinos along with other people.
Yeah, the Stardust.
Charlie's history was, I'm sorry, he wasn't part of that. He became a killer for Murder Incorporated and wound up in jail.
Right. Well, if you want to know more about the Stardust is portrayed in the book and in the movie Casino with Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci, but they didn't call it the Stardust. They forgot what they called it. They changed the names, and they changed the name of the casino too. But it was about Stardust. Now, can you explain how the actual murder happened with your Uncle Charlie killing Dutch Schultz?
Well, from what I understand, and from because after all, I never talked about it with him, or any of the crimes with any of these people. They might talk about other people's crimes, especially if someone was dead or something. But the way that it was reconstructed by my brother too was that Charlie and Mendy Weiss and a driver went to they knew where he was going to be. Because he sort of held court and also had his office in the back of a bar in New Jersey. And so Mendy Weiss and Charlie went in, and there were several variations to the story, but Dutch Schultz was in the men's room because they asked the driver to go in first because these guys wouldn't know the driver, but they would know Charlie and Mendy Weiss because these were already well-known criminals. He came back, he said, 4 guys are in there. And when they went in, there were only 3. There's only 3 guys, and Charlie went in the bathroom. There's Dutch Schultz at the urinal. He shoots Dutch Schultz, who comes out and winds up There's a well-known photo. I'm not sure if it was set up by a photographer or not, but he's sloping over the table. And they killed the other 3 guys inside and outside. So it was a massive shootout. And Dutch Schultz is dying, and Charlie goes through his pockets because that was one of the things that he often did. Supposedly, he had a rep for going through people's pockets. And I did hear him say to my brother, and maybe he was joking because I can't recall if my brother, but we both laughed. Charlie said, "You know why I went through people's pockets?" No, why? He said, because the next guy who was going to have his hand in the guy's pocket was a homicide detective. He would take the money if I didn't. And my brother broke up laughing because by then my brother I think he worked homicide at one time too.
Right.
But Charlie, when he said that, we just broke up laughing. So that was pretty much, and Dutch Schultz died about a day or 2 later. He was babbling a lot, a stenographer taking down notes and things. And one of the things that came out of it was he was either then, and I forgot how the story became, that he had he had hidden and buried millions of dollars in jewelry or whatever it was in upstate New York, where he was known to go. And so to this day, there are people looking for his stash. But I always tended to believe that that was the words of the dying man.
Yeah, I mean that's like the Al Capone.
Geraldo Rivera thing.
Yeah, exactly. Found a broken bottle. That was great. That's he's the only guy that could do that and still have a career. Unbelievable.
That's for sure. Good way. Yeah.
So now, after that, he wasn't arrested for that murder until Weiss actually testified.
A.B. Relis testified.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I get them confused. Relis, I apologize. Right, Relis testified 5 years later.
About 5 or 6 years later, the murder happened in November 35, and I think it was 5 years later. It was the spring of 40.
Okay, so
spring of 41, because it was because all the stuff, the A.B. Relis stuff happened a month before Pearl Harbor.
Wow.
Wow. I think A.B. Relis was thrown out the window a month before Pearl Harbor, and there's a picture I have in the book that sort of, to me, symbolizes these guys' mentality. The men that I met as older men, the ones who survived, like Charlie and my Uncle George, who was a gangster till the day, no matter how much money he had, yachts, and he was really well set up. They still were gangsters at heart. But a picture that was taken of Louis Capone, no relation to Al Capone, another Murder Incorporated hitman, and Mendy Weiss. They're on the train going to Sing Sing, and they're looking at the camera and they're smiling. They have suits, ties on. 2 or 3 days before that, they were convicted of killing a shopkeeper in Brooklyn. That's what they wound up getting. And Lepke, the boss, all 3 of them were convicted of it. They were sentenced to death in Sing Sing, but it wasn't like death was going to take place a month later. So these guys are sitting on a train going up to Sing Sing to be executed. No handcuffs, no orange jumpsuit, no cops with masks on and automatic, no SWAT team cops. They just have the New York Times folded over their lap and they're smiling into the camera. And that, to me, told me their mentality, as opposed to, say, me if I was on the train.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
They made men different back then. They understood that was part of the life.
Absolutely.
And I could never relate to it, but there's something about when you grow up in such poverty that your word and your loyalty means so much. And these guys, they understood that. And there were so many guys who died in jail who went to the electric chair and kept their mouth shut for, some like people like that you mentioned. But how long you said your Uncle Charlie did 25 years in prison?
23.
23. He didn't get the electric chair.
No, once he realized that A.B. Relis was going to testify against him, and another hitman named TikTok Tannenbaum, the 2 of them were informing on all their associates in Murder Incorporated. Charlie pleaded no contest, and the judge, they gave him life in prison, but he wound up getting out 23 years later. Supposedly, and I can't recall if I may have read this, but I can't recall ever hearing it through the family, but he volunteered for a suicide mission in World War II.
Really?
So they put him in jail in 1941, and so World War. Our participation in the war was still going on. Would go on for 4 years, but they wouldn't accept him.
Wow.
Not surprisingly.
Could you imagine if these men were able to look at the young men today, what they would think?
It's funny you said that, because even when Charlie was alive, there were always pictures in the 70s of white collar criminals, and I always laugh about it. My sister and I, she's an attorney in Boston, the guys who are going to jail and with hospital beds and oxygen tanks and walkers just when they're being sentenced now. And Charlie, I remember that was happening back then too, and he always thought that was sort of funny that they weren't, that they had all these props to get a lighter sentence.
Right. So he gets out 23 years later. What year is it when he gets out?
1964, and I was at City College, just about getting out. My brother was about a year or two into the police department.
And what kind of life did he lead after he got out of prison?
It's interesting you say that, because a few years later, about 1970, 71, I was trying to get into the Cameramen's Union, which was tough to get into. And I just happened to go in to see my father, who had a garment center trucking company, because of all the people. They all protected him because of who. And there was Uncle Charlie sitting there and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm going to try to get in the company." He said, "Oh, the first job I had when I got out of jail was at the Coliseum up by Columbus Circle. There was a Coliseum there. It's no longer there. And the stagehands, and let's go up and see if we can get you in the stagehands and move you in." Yeah, this whole thing worked out, but it never worked. And when we went in the cab to go back to my father's place, he slapped me on my foot, on my knee, and he said, "You know, Alan, in the old days before I went to jail, if I wanted anything from a union official, I just opened the window and said, 'It's a long way down.'"
Yeah.
To me, I always remember. But what did he do after he got out? After he worked as a stagehand? If you were Italian, Jewish, and Irish, and an ex-con, that was a good job to get, to show the parole board that you had it was a good paying job.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to be connected, as Charlie was. But a lot of those guys, Italian and Jewish ex-gangsters, they gave them little shops in the garment center that are no longer there because they don't do any manufacturing. Maybe a button shop, a tie shop, a belt shop, where they would produce stuff, and that's how they made their living. And Charlie had one of those shops in the garment center, and that was good for me because I was able to see him a fair amount of times when I visited my father, who was real close to him. So that's what he did pretty much until he passed away in the late 70s.
Did he ever explain to you what? Oh, sorry. Okay.
No, he was out. He died about 15 years after he was out of jail.
Did he ever describe what jail was like to you, or any instances that went on in jail? Because, jail back then, it was completely, it was a little bit different than it is today. We think of mass incarceration. We think of, the Mexican mafia. We think of the Black Guerrilla. I think it's the Black Guerrilla Gang. And, well, back then it was, Italian, Irish, Jewish. Did he ever explain to you what it was like in prison?
Well, he never really discussed that. He did, other people did, and I was in party to those conversations. But it was, as you were describing, it was different because the guys who were made guys, the guys who had reps really had it much better than the ones who didn't. And it wasn't 23-hour lockdowns either. People spent a lot of time in population. I can't really say all the differences, but one of the other guys who was in the extended family, who he learned how to play saxophone and speak Spanish in prison during his time in prison. I don't think you can do that these days in that environment. But Charlie had the reputation, people told me, of being a model prisoner.
Really?
He was a model prisoner wherever he went. He was in New Jersey because that's where the crimes were committed, and that's where he pled guilty. So he did 23 years in Jersey prisons, and he was supposedly one of the people that never gave anybody any trouble for which we did his time. Never said a word.
Yeah,
when he was being questioned after Abe Rellis turned him in, he showed up at the district attorney's office, and a man named Burton Turkis wrote a book about Murder Incorporated. That's sort of the standard book. And he was a young 24-year-old assistant to the DA. And he questioned Charlie, and he wrote in the book, he came in so well dressed every day, never said it. He never said a word. He came in every day but he never said a word to law enforcement.
Yeah. It was still code to him. It was still
total. Yes, he was going to do his time. He was going to do it.
That was it.
If he died in prison, so be it.
Hey, what's so funny is, I remember my father telling me, because my father would have been 88 years old, and when I was young, and these guys were getting arrested in the neighborhood, or we had moved to Staten Island. Immediately they go to turn state's evidence, immediately. And they're ratting this one out, ratting that one out. And my father, would tell me, it's not like it was, back in the day, these guys would die in prison. There was a code and that was it. And they knew that part of the job was getting arrested and part of the job was murder. And they understood that fully. And, but we're talking like in the late 80s, 90s now. And they were, immediately they're making deals with the government and so on and so forth. But then they also didn't have the RICO law. The RICO law came out.
Exactly. Yeah.
That really hurt them bad. Yeah, they were basically gentleman killers. They were controlled killers. What was funny is they still treated, children well. They still treated ladies well. They still had manners. But behind closed doors, if they had to get a job done, it was,
And even when they were successful, no matter how successful they were still street guys.
Oh, yeah. You can't take it out of them.
You can't take it out of them. And I thought of my Uncle George, who to me, he had a yacht, he had a big house in Florida. But at the end of the day, they were all looking for action. And they all had pieces of each other's business. And if they had to be in a brawl in the street, they would do it no matter how much money they had in the bank. No matter what they had to do, they would still do. I always remember that being something that really impressed me about them when I was younger. And I don't know how I was a college guy to them, but I also had a life that was of interest to them because their lives were in some ways more
glamorous.
They didn't go out to places I did. They weren't going to get on a plane and go to Rio, Puerto Rico even, and have vacations. And they were interested in a lot of things that I found them interesting people, as almost all of them were. And so did my sister, who's I reconnected with in the way of talking about all those people that we knew. And a couple of years ago, I forgot about all the photos we had. We had family photos that I hadn't seen in 20 or 30 years. And I was at my sister's house one day, and there were these photos of all of these people, Johnny Dioguardi with my father in the Copacabana. And then the next page would be a picture of his FBI photo. So that sort of was one of the things that made me feel good about writing a book, because to get out the story that you were just describing about gentlemen killers in a lot of ways. And yeah, it's
here is the book. It is Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz, The Jewish Mob: A Family Affair by Alan Geik. There it is. Where can you get the book?
Amazon. It's there in that paperback format that you're holding, as well as Kindle. You can get it at Barnes & Noble. Any place you would order a book from, you can get it from. And Amazon's been selling a fair amount, which I'm really happy about.
That's great. But buy the book, because it goes into much greater detail than we have be able to discuss in within an hour. It goes into much greater detail about Dutch Schultz, about your Uncle Charlie, about Murder Incorporated, about the other major players during the times of Prohibition and World War II and so on and so forth. And it gets into greater detail about the amazing lives these guys led. And it brings you back to a different era that you can only picture in a movie, if you will, right? It doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't, not even close to existing. Nobody could really understand their temperament, their code, their loyalty, their character, if you will, because I know they were killers, but their character stood out, right? Absolutely. And like we discussed before, the book goes into greater detail, but we basically discussed how they were gentlemen, and they knew that the part of the job was they were either going to wind up dead or in prison. And there are some famous murders and people that went to prison that tells a story like that. There was Sammy the Bull tells a story where he had to kill somebody who was a real gangster, and he knew they were coming for him, and they actually asked him. I think the story goes, he asked Sammy to take off his shoes because that was a message to his wife that, when I die, this is I'm thinking of, And then there was another gentleman that everybody knows of, Tony Salerno. They call him Fat Tony or Tough Tony. Nobody was going to call him Fat Tony. Yeah, and he went to jail, and he was the street boss of the Genovese crime family, but the real boss was the Chin. He went to prison, and Vinny the Chin, didn't really go to prison until years and years later, and he never said a word about it. These guys were made differently. And even by the time I was a kid into the 80s and 90s, like I said before, I don't want to repeat myself, but the reason why I'm driving it home is because, the guys that I grew up with, they were tough, or the guys that I knew of, they were tough. But as soon as they had to go to jail, they would make a plea bargain. They would make a deal. They would turn state's evidence, and immediately. And then, you have interviews with them now. I've interviewed several of them. They see major interviews with them now, and they all kind of justify why they did it. But back then, these men, like your uncle, there was no justification. That's it. You went to prison. That's it. You got murdered. If you were murdered, that was part of the life. That was it. And there's something very admirable about the loyalty to a code that way. It's almost like the samurai. When he loses, he has to get decapitated, and they knew that was the consequence, right? And it was the same kind of character, if you will. I know it's a strange analogy, but truly buy the book on Amazon. The link will be in the description. Click it, buy the book. It's an amazing read, and it goes into a lot greater detail. Mr. Alan Geik, I truly appreciate you coming on. It was an honor and a pleasure.
Likewise.
We will be in touch, because I definitely want to talk about movies.
For sure. I'd love to do that.
All right. Sounds good. And have a good night, sir.
You too. Thank you.